One of South Korea's greatest economic strengths is also one of their biggest economic weaknesses. Their country's economy is defined by a series of massive business groups with names familiar to everyone: Samsung, Hyundai, and LG. These groups power its export economy and dominate its people's everyday lives. They also manipulate the Korean economy to their own advantage and pay millions to maintain corrupt ties with the highest levels of power in Korea. Corruption in Korea predates the modern state. The Japanese colonial state and its agricultural economy was also quite corrupt and unequal. The large landlords earned all the income and ruthlessly exploited the farmers. This administration ended with World War II. Much of its legacies, however, passed on to the new South Korean government, which fell under the Western sphere of influence. Its first president, Syngman Rhee, thus was a staunch anti-communist, and I guess he proved it. First, by committing a variety of massacres against suspected communists that left some 100,000 dead. The Bordeaux League massacre in 1950, I felt, was especially cruel. And second, Rhee created the Chaebol. He needed to raise funds to fight the Korean War, so starting in 1946 and peaking in the 1950s, his government sold off many of the assets they seized from the old Japanese state, along with a few other prized state-owned entities. The prices for these privatizations of public assets were determined via private negotiation rather than public auction, a steal by any value investing metric. Valuable companies like Tongyang Beers, today Oriental Breweries, Daehan Textile, and Tongyang Cement, heart of the Tongyang Group. Like with the Zaibatsu of Japan, the purchasers of these amazing assets would eventually become the Chaebol. Then in 1961, Park Chung-hee led a military coup that ended the Second Republic. Immediately after the coup, Park arrested the heads of the Chaebol on the basis that they were corruptly accumulating wealth. But very quickly afterwards, his government negotiated a Crony Capitalism deal with the Chaebol. Park wanted to emulate Japan's industrialization process and sought the company's help. The Chaebol would support Park's policies for import substitution and later exports. The Korean government would in turn lend the Chaebol foreign currency loans at below market interest rates so that they can acquire foreign technologies and build up their capacities in those industries. And oh, by the way, the Chaebol will also contribute funds for Park's upcoming $200 million presidential election campaign. These came in the form of 10 to 15% loan commissions, namely kickbacks. Companies realized that the best way to acquire cheap capital and get rich was to be good friends with the president. For instance, Park Chung-hee maintained very close personal ties with Chung Ju-yong of Hyundai and Kim Woo-jung of Daewoo. The kickbacks also grew over the years. Adjusted to 1990 prices, the top 5 Chaebol contributed over 800 million won annually to the Park government before 1972. That grew to 1.5 billion after 1972. Over the next 20 years, the government and the Chaebol ran Korean society as its dominant actors. The companies helped fund the government's political campaigns and satisfy its social compact of growing the economy. The government in turn granted the Chaebol privileges and used its force to impose the costs of the Chaebol's excesses onto greater society. For instance, in 1971, the Chaebol found themselves over-leveraged and requested a bailout. The Korean government converted all the Chaebol's private market loans to 5-year public ones and froze private interest rates. Small lenders got hosed since nominal listed interest rates for such public loans did not exceed inflation. But as Korea entered the turbulent 1980s, the military dictatorship gradually lost its monopoly grip on power. The partnership began to get a little shaky as the balance of power started to shift. By the mid-1980s, things had tipped decisively in the Chaebol's favor. The top 5 Chaebol accounted for nearly 20% of the country's GDP and 45% of its mining/manufacturing output. The top 10 Chaebol owned an average of 8.6 manufacturing businesses, 20 to 40 businesses in total. Korea's Chaebol-centric strategy had suffocated the country's small and medium-sized business sector. From 1966 to 1976, the number of manufacturing firms in Korea grew just 10%, but their size exploded 176%. By contrast, Taiwan pursued a less cozy state-business relationship with its corporate elites and also did not get hit with a devastating war. They saw its number of manufacturing firms grow by 150% and firm size by 29% over the same period of time. This vast imbalance between the Chaebol and the rest of the country started to become an issue. The people of South Korea disapproved of the outsized power these big business groups had. The people were getting richer, and with that, they wanted more than just higher wages. They wanted better environmental regulations, working conditions, and a better life in general. The government, now increasingly democratic, had to respond, switching from a stance of support to one of regulation. The problem was that the government's leaders still needed the Chaebol's financial contributions to stay in power. This continued regardless of who was in charge. Park Chung-hee was assassinated, and another military leader, Chun Do-hwan, came to lead South Korea afterwards. During his administration, the Chaebol contributed 15 to 22 billion won to high-level political campaigns, and 21 to 25 billion won during the subsequent administration of President Roh Tae-woo. This corrupt deal between the Korean government and business evolved this way partly because of how weak Korea's political parties have been. During the military dictatorship era, parties served as simple shells for their candidates. People voted the party simply because they wanted to vote for the candidate. Then the country democratized in 1987, holding free and open elections for the first time. But after so many years of military dictatorship, there had been no time to build suitable political campaigning norms. Without an above-board financing system, parties and candidates found themselves starved for cash, which made them vulnerable to corruption, which means the Chaebol are still able to get what they want: government aid in the form of plentiful capital, favorable regulations, and protections from competition. The Asian financial crisis would demonstrate the consequences of Korea's inability to rein in their big businesses. In the 10 years after democratization in 1987, the Chaebol gained substantial political power. For instance, in 1988, Daewoo Group was able to force the National Assembly to amend a law so to allow the government to bail out the ailing Daewoo Shipbuilding Corporation. They also used that power to get rapid liberalization reforms to aid their growth and expansion. One of those reforms had been to allow the Chaebol to more easily access foreign capital financing. In other words, take out cheap loans denominated in foreign currencies. This would eventually kick off a massive debt boom that ended in the Asian financial crisis. Another major reform allowed the Chaebol to take limited ownership stakes in non-bank financial companies. This encouraged super complicated cross-ownership structures, obscuring their true size. For instance, the Samsung Group and its controlling Rhee family. The Rhees own a minority of the shares in Samsung-affiliated firms, yet through that small slice, they exercise operating control over almost all of those companies. These companies' increasingly complex structures meant that nobody knew which subsidiaries made money and which ones burned it. The profitable companies started propping up the weak ones, leading to market inefficiencies and oversupply in certain industries. This all came to a head in 1997, which vastly pared back the power of the Chaebol. It left an open door for reforms, encouraging a more, quote-unquote, common prosperity, to steal a term. A variety of reforms were imposed on the ailing Chaebol by both the Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyung administrations. The goals were to prevent another financial crisis from ever happening again by limiting debt capacity and cross-shareholder structures. Some of these reforms succeeded, but not without wide-ranging consequences. For instance, in my video about Hanjin Shipping, I talked about how the company had to reduce its debt to equity loads below 200%. It forced Hanjin to sell off ships and lease others to retain capacity, converting those financing costs into operating ones. Reforms did cut a lot of the fat in the Korean car industry. In 1997, there had been 5 independent Korean car companies. Soon after, there would be just one, Hyundai. The Chaebol dialed back their affiliates and further separated them. In 1997, a sample of Chaebol showed 819 affiliates. 3 years later, that number became 544. Dividends to minority shareholders The ones getting stiffed the most by the cross-holdings structure increased from 2.2 trillion won in 2001 to 10.8 trillion by 2006. The crisis also helped create the Korean export juggernaut. Realizing the unfriendly domestic environment, the biggest chaebols seized on a variety of free trade agreements in the 2000s and turned outwards. They became wildly successful. By 2013, 86% of Samsung's revenue came from abroad, and this success drove the Korean economy's top-line recovery. From 1998 to 2010, Korea's economy grew at an average rate of 5%. A very good number. But that shiny golden number hid a variety of troubling social issues beneath the surface. On the basis of GDP growth alone, the Korean economy grew well and everything should be fine, right? The problem, however, was that the benefits of that growth fell to a very small cohort of people. A significant gap opened up between the haves and the have-nots in Korean society. In 2013, the Chaebol brought in over 50% of revenue and value add in the manufacturing sector, but they employed less than 20% of the sector's employees. As part of the negotiations during the reform era after 1997, the government wanted the Chaebol to become more profitable so that they can more easily service their debts. The Chaebol agreed, but wanted to make it easier for them to lay people off. The Korean government agreed. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their jobs. Many of them have never found regular salaried work since and instead work irregularly. Elder poverty in Korea has since reached 4 times the OECD average. Income share for the top 1% of Korean society rose from 7% before 1997 to 12% in the mid-2010s. The Korean people recognize this inequality, that they have seen and shared none of the success by the country's so-called national champions and its plutocratic owners. And that is why the Korean people voted for a change of direction in 2007. President Lee Myung-bak is a conservative from the Park Chung-hee line. A former businessman and CEO of Hyundai Construction, his 2007 presidential campaign emphasized economic recovery after what he called a lost decade of liberal rule. Note again that the Korean economy grew 5% a year from 1997 to 2007. Nothing like the glory years of the 80s and early 90s, but very good by almost any measure. Lee's campaign made the 747 promise to the Korean people. By bringing CEO-style management to Korea, he would raise GDP growth to 7%, achieve a per capita income of $40,000, and make Korea the 7th largest economy. Lee won with the highest margin in years, but record low voter participation indicated that the Korean people were starting to lose faith in their government's ability to curb the country's social inequalities and bring the good times back. Fundamentally, Lee's business policies indicated that he felt the previous 10 years had held back the Chaebol's abilities to compete against other multinational corporate giants. Thus, not that big business was too big for Korea, but big business was too small for the world. He lowered the corporate tax rate from 25% to 20%, raised the ceiling on non-bank financial investment, and amnestied a number of executives convicted in wake of the financial crisis. He also oversaw a continuation of market-oriented reforms, giving more decision-making powers to the industry. One can argue that Lee's goal would bring back the era of Park Chung-hee's rapid economic growth and development. Lee traded on those sentiments, especially when he added Park-era economic planners to his administration. But unlike with Park, Lee did not force the Chaebol to funnel profits into new and risky industries, something wild and crazy like quantum computers, offshore wind, or fusion energy, that the Chaebol would otherwise not really invest in. The government failed to do that and instead funneled money to rust-belt industries like construction and infrastructure. In the end, the Lee administration could not deliver the growth that they promised. GDP growth has continued to decline throughout the 2000s. Korean presidents only have one term, so Lee soon stepped down. In 2018, he was arrested for charges of bribery, embezzlement, and tax fraud. During the next presidential election in 2012, conservative Park Geun-hye moved leftwards on her messaging. She combined her platform of nostalgia for the glory years with stronger emphasis on welfare. Notably, however, she did not advocate for a higher capital gains tax, key to the accelerating Korean wealth gap. Modern corruption committed by the Chaebol is done to maximize their wealth and market power in Korea and elsewhere. Two areas in particular focus: maintaining control of their empire, mostly through the use of tax manipulations and legislation, and regulatory capture. I want to talk more on the latter. A lot of people today take a nihilistic perspective to the wealth inequality and big business corruption problem. Gosh, it might even be quote-unquote cool to do so now. Who cares? We can't do anything about it. They got all the politicians in their pockets. The reality is that these actions have consequences, and that came to be most apparent with the 2014 Syngman sinking, which claimed 304 lives, most of them high school students. A variety of things have been said about the Syngman sinking. Most of them are true. For instance, I mentioned that the ferry already had been quite old when it was first purchased and converted to passenger use, and that it had been very overloaded when it set off on its journey. The most proximate reason why the death rate was so high, however, was that safety and rescue regulations were ignored, and had been so for a while. For too long, the regulatory agency and the company worked closely together to ignore violations and keep the profitable status quo. A status quo which included the continued rotation of government employees into the industry, and the ferry company's continued monopoly privilege of the lucrative Incheon-Jeju ferry route. Without pressure from either government or market, why should a ferry company try harder? Why should any company? South Korea's struggle with its biggest companies continues. President Park Geun-hye's administration ended in a spate of corruption scandals and impeachment. Her successor, President Moon Jae-in, has responded with certain business reforms and higher tax rates, and it seems to have brought about a bit of an improvement, at least in the court of public opinion. However, the South Korean economy, like Taiwan's to some extent, is now quite dependent on its handful of super powerful global companies. It is more than likely that substantial reform will weaken their place in the world marketplace against companies in the United States, Europe, and China. South Korean democratic society has become increasingly polarized like many others in the world, and the issue will be furiously debated. Chaebol reform and what to do about it continues to be an issue in South Korean presidential politics, right up there with what to do about North Korea. Alright, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, sign up for the newsletter, and I'll see you guys next time.